found out on my way to Harlem. Ellington, you don't live around here. He moved away one day, so they say, from Harlem. I can hear his echo still. Now, you can't keep me away from where I was born. I was baptized by my daddy's horn. Now, you can't keep me away from where I was born. I was baptized by the jazz man, the horn. Oh, I found out on my way through Harlem. Okay, welcome to another edition of Community and Technology. Today is Wednesday, June 10th, 2020. I'm here with my co-host, Lena Marvin. Hey, Lena, welcome.
Hello, hello.
And Dave Burstein. I think Dave is with us. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest who we haven't seen in a while. Not a stranger, but a long time no see, Miss Rosa Gina Lawrence. Welcome, Rosa Gina. Can you turn your mic up again? We didn't hear you there.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
You're a little soft.
I
Okay.
I just need to get closer.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
No problem. Hi. Just by way of introduction, why don't I let Lena introduce Rosa Gina, because you guys are old cohorts together and radio pals. Introduce Rosa Gina to our audience, if you would, Lena.
Absolutely. Rose was
Your audio dropped out, Lena.
all right. Rose Regina was on the radio with me back a few years ago, back before 2014, 15, whatever. We did Technicolor Radio on WHCR 90.3 FM. So she is a security technologist specializing in operational and information security for activists, journalists, and human rights defenders. She's the person who has gotten me to use Signal, which is the encrypted chat thing I occasionally mention my fondness for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, welcome, Rosa Gina. You are certainly here at an opportune time. What we kind of wanted to focus on today was, of course, what's going on in this country and the world and the protests, and talk a little bit about the role that technology is playing in helping to organize and amplify and just kind of make the whole movement happen. I don't really know where to begin, but why don't you just start wherever makes sense to you. Tell us a little bit about your perspective of technology and the role of social organizing and social protests and how it's working today.
Well, oh goodness, that is such an incredibly large topic. And it is one that I am feeling so much more optimistic about right now than I was a year ago. I think that one of the things that has really struck me is seeing how a bunch of different technologies have come together to help build the momentum that we're seeing. So of course there is the role that social media has played in terms of not just the ability for people to amplify voices, but specifically the nature of social media means that it is much more a reflection of who is using it than many forms of traditional media are or really could be. So I think that's notable. But beyond that, I think that what we are seeing is something that probably would not be able to exist without smartphones. So when we look at how movement for Black Lives and anti-police brutality organizing has worked, one of the things that we see is the importance of documentation. And smartphones have meant that the vast majority of people now have much, much, much easier access to fairly high quality recording devices, both for audio, video, and also just taking photos than was previously true. On top of which, the digital nature of these recordings means that it is much easier for people to just start recording. So for my undergrad, I did a lot of photography as part of it. And one of the things that made that hard for me to keep going with and kept a lot of people out is just the cost of film and the developing chemicals. And what that meant is that every single photo had a cost. And even when you're looking at early digital cameras, the price of image storage was still really high. And so I think that one of the things that has struck me is the extent to which not only having the technology, but having the technology that facilitates over versus under documenting is just absolutely crucial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I've noticed that too. You know, I started out in 35 millimeter film many years ago with the old Nicomet. You might remember that camera.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, film was very precious. You know, and how many rolls do you have? And you only got 2 rolls of film, and only got 72 shots or 36 shots, and you were very careful and selective with what you when you snap that shutter, because as you said, every image there was a cost. And today, you know, I sometimes make jokes when I go out with my camera. I tell folks, well, you know, go ahead, I got plenty of film. And of course, it's, you know, it's all digital and it's virtually unlimited.
Right. Plus, the other thing that I find myself guilty of forgetting is that back when I was working with film, I didn't know how the image was going to come out. Whereas now you have that immediate visual feedback. And I think that that's also incredibly helpful for really softening the learning curve of documentation and backing up what you see with video evidence.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's made the common person, the lay person, a photographer. You no longer need special skills. You got autofocus and auto tracking and auto lighting and just point and shoot, and it really works. So it has really opened up the whole field of documentation to virtually everyone. And of course, you know, the back piece is the network, the internet, that enables the instantaneous sharing of all those images across the globe. We didn't always have that. We kind of maybe take it for granted today, but I don't, because I'm old school. I remember when there was no network at all.
I mean, I remember giving trainings where I would tell people, bring a addressed envelope with correct postage on it when you're going somewhere, so that you can put your rolls of film inside the envelope and drop it in a mailbox. Because otherwise it's very easy for someone who's opposed to the human rights documentation that you're doing to take your film and destroy it. And now the ability to automatically upload things to the cloud just totally changes people's ability to protect what they're able to capture.
You know, I'd be interested in both of your comments. I read a piece, and I'm not sure what the publication was. I think it was Technology Review. And the writer talked about how the cameras have been around, smart cameras have been around for maybe 5-10 years, documenting a lot of the police brutality and a lot of the murders. And, you know, we have video evidentiary documentation. Eric Garner is a classic case where it was clearly documented what happened, and yet no repercussions or redress. And go ahead.
Was this
hey, we got with George Floyd? It's like, I mean, clearly it was such an ugly Oh man, I mean, just thinking about it gives me chills. I've only been able to watch it twice, but it was so ugly and gruesome. But there have been ugly and gruesome murders that we've seen before on film, and it didn't take off like it did today. What do you think is different? Or maybe it's just an accumulation.
I think just the volume. Yeah, I think so. I think that historically, trying to think how best to say this. I guess historically, the parts of America who have been disinclined to believe when people talk about systematic police violence against communities of color have been much, much, much more able to write off a single video. And what we have now is such a proliferation that it starts to break down that whole idea of just a couple of bad apples, and instead we're able to have enough documented incidents that that it becomes harder and harder for anyone to, with a straight face, say that this is rare.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really fantastic website called mappingpoliceviolence.org. It's one of the most startling uses of technology to do visualization of data that I've seen in a while, where you're just looking at a map of pinpoints just flickering by because police have killed over 1,000 people in 2018 in the United States. But in addition to just, well, that's a lot of people and I can write it off in this way, it has this summation, still talking data, still talking numbers. Black people were 24% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. So it's this clear numbers-driven visualization. And the other bit is they have a map or they have a calendar where you can see the 27 days out of 19 when the police didn't kill anyone. And you're just looking at these numbers and you're like, wow. And one of the questions that's come up is like, well, this sort of data is like, is this new? Is this old? There was just a lot of data being for a long time. Like it was, you know, police protecting themselves and protecting their information. It's interesting to see what, how that looks.
What's that site again, Lena? Say that again for our listeners and viewers.
Mappingpoliceviolence.org.
Yeah, well, one of the statistics that I ran across in just looking at what's going on today, and one of the writers reviewed it, he looked at 10 years between 2005 and 2014. And during that period, only 48 officers were charged with murder or manslaughter for use of lethal force. So more than 1,000 people a year are killed by police. So that's a 10-year period, 10,000 people killed by police, only 48 police charged. So there's a big disconnect in my mind when you look at that. But you know, it goes back, you know, many years. I mean, you know, Abner Louima, you know, pulling out a cell phone. Oh, I thought he had a gun. You know, the young man in his grandmother's backyard a couple years ago. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I mean, it's you know, it's heartening to see America, and not just America, but folks across the planet starting to wake up and recognize what's going on. And of course, the problem is so systemic that even as we're looking at the demonstrations, the police continue to brutalize folks right there in front of the camera. I mean, the 75-year-old man up in Buffalo that got knocked down, I mean, it was outrageous. And looking at the level of aggression or these cops with their batons just going after people. I mean, it's amazing. And you know, another story that I read talked about how the policeman that killed George Floyd, how he looked into the eyes of the young lady, Miss Frazier, who was filming him, taping him, and just kind of tried to stare her down. And what the writer of the piece said, he knew he was being recorded. He knew he was probably being streamed live, but so what? I mean, just the arrogance is unbelievable.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that comes up when we're talking about looking at police violence is and I tend to think of this coming from the perspective of someone who works with community organizers and has been one, and really believes in building movements. When I look at this issue, one of the things that I really see is how clear the blue wall of silence is in terms of what role it plays. And I think that different police forces have always had ties to each other. They've always had these networks, they've always had these connections, they've always had avenues and mechanics and organizations for sharing what they do, what they know, what their approaches are. And I think that part of why we're getting this movement to have the level of visibility and power that it has right now is because we've finally been able to build up those networks, and because of the social media stuff I was talking about. And so I think that like one of the few things that gives me real hope on this is, while you have that kind of just like intense assumption of impunity on their side, is knowing that we also are building up our ability to push back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Rosa Gina, talk a little bit about how folks are using some of the social media and the other tools. I don't want to just take that for granted when we say, oh, we're using social media. Kind of break down a little bit for us how that's happening and some mechanics of what's driving that.
Okay, oh goodness, all right. So I'm going to preface this with, when I talk about social media, I feel very old, and I have to work very hard not to be like, oh my goodness, the kids these days, because it's not really my jam in many ways, but I have a lot of real appreciation for people who are able to really use the platform on their own terms. So I think that the way that social media is being used, I mean, there's the live streaming, which you mentioned earlier, in talking about capturing human rights violations and other forms, and specifically police brutality. And so to me, I would lump that in with social media, because part of it is, who are you live streaming to, and what is your assumption around people actually seeing it? So I would put like live streaming as one of the ways in which that is having an impact. In one of my previous jobs, I worked specifically on labor rights for low wage, largely immigrant workers. And from that, I got this amazing little mirror into how they were doing their organizing among very low wage workers, and also a little bit of insight into kind of the very start of and the bit before the formation of Fight for 15. And one of the things that I saw was that the way that it was working was that there were social networks that existed beforehand, not in the technical sense, but in the community sense, and that people have these strong connections with other folks. And that is especially true within marginalized communities where people need to rely on each other more. And so both the workers groups that I was working with, and then also organizations like Fight for 15, it wasn't going into nothing. It was allowing people to more easily talk to the people they already had a relationship with. And that I think one of the ways in which social media is playing out is because you don't have to necessarily start a one-on-one conversation. Some people feel a lot more comfortable putting out something that is political. And some people also are exposed to those political conversations in a way that they wouldn't be because someone just wouldn't necessarily start it with that person, but they're seeing it continuously pop up. They're seeing hashtags come up. And so it's a way of kind of moving some of these conversations from just like a one-on-one level to more of a community level. And so that's one way in which I see social media really, really feeding in. And I feel like I'm also seeing bits of evidence of that being true when it comes to what we're currently experiencing. And looking at movement building in this way, I think that one of the things that sort of sets right now apart from say back in 2014 is that social media has pushed this conversation into pockets of society that it was not reaching before. And so part of what we're seeing is not just people who are directly affected talking about these topics, but people who are not directly affected feeling like there is a mechanic for them to start having conversations with other people who are not directly affected in ways that had not previously been happening.
So my favorite example of this community talking to this community and the solidarity that people want to help make change happen is very silly, and I love it. Stu, did you hear about Dallas's iWatch app?
No, I didn't.
The police in Dallas have an app called iWatch, where they ask people during these protests, take footage of people doing illegal things so we can go and catch them.
Mm-hmm.
And in response, the Korean pop music scene downloaded this app and sent dancing videos. They flooded the police app with K-pop dancing videos in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And it just is so beautiful and such an interesting example of digital activism, where people are going, oh, you're using this app, you are using it to hurt these communities. We will use your app to send you dancing videos. And it's one of the things that has popped across my screen that has kind of illustrated the interesting the shows of solidarity between various communities. That's heartwarming, but also kind of effective. Like they did take down this app, It was not like it's the equivalent of a denial of service attack because they flooded
it.
videos,
Mm-hmm.
which is wonderful, but also effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I think that some of the information that Lebanese and Palestinian protesters have been able to kind of pass on to people in the US who are dealing with tear gas and flashbangs for the first time, as well as the extent to which some protesters in the US have been able to pick up and start using techniques that kind of were developed in Hong Kong pro-democracy protests in the past couple of years has been really neat to see.
We are streaming live on the WHCR.org on their mobile site. So let me just say, you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, broadcasting live from the city of New York, the voice of Harlem. Okay, we're back, Community and Technology, with Lena, Dave, and special guest, Rosa Gina Lawrence, talking about technology and social activism. Rose Regina is a specialist in this area. And how long have you been working with technology and social movements, Regina? Well, I don't want to. I'm sorry. I shouldn't do that. I always forget. Ladies have kicked me under the table so many times.
No, it's.
I'm sorry. I'm very insensitive.
I have a way to describe it. She was recently talking to a young activist about how you did protest before cell phones.
Okay.
So,
yep. So I'm gonna go ahead and give me just a moment because math is hard. I'm gonna say over 15 years.
Wow. Okay.
Over 15 years.
Wow.
When looking at how protest has changed from having cell phones
Mm-hmm.
to having cell phone, from no to some, it's been really interesting. I have a friend who's been doing meta work in the pro here in St. Louis, and they have described these kind of exchanges where they have text chains and groups of people, and it might be on Facebook Messenger, which isn't a great idea because what conversations can be subpoenaed or gotten very easily by folks or be watched without anyone even really needing to go through court systems. Zoom has recently said that any free use of Zoom, they are handing over to police as they want.
So it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I actually think slightly more nefarious. And I think it's actually important to highlight some of the details on this topic when it comes to technology and activism. So what Zoom is specifically saying is that it has committed itself to developing and implementing end-to-end encryption for their video calls. So what end-to-end encryption means is that the entire conversation is encrypted from one end of the conversation to the other end of the conversation. So that would mean if I'm having a phone call with Lena, nobody except the two of us is going to be able to understand the content of that conversation by intercepting the digital part of it. They could still be in the same room, but we're just talking about the digital part. But if it's all four of us having a conversation, end-to-end encryption means that the four of us are the only people who are going to be able to engage with the conversation unencrypted. So what Zoom is talking about doing is basically having a two-tiered service where companies who are able to pay for Zoom accounts are able to have this kind of encryption, which effectively keeps all sorts of people from like, you know, the police and the FBI to competing companies and just like random criminals on the internet and people who are just poking around to keep all of those folks out of their conversations. But they're not going to extend this security measure because it really is about security. Not just about privacy. They're not going to extend that to free accounts, which are frequently used by activists. And their justification for doing so is specifically so that they can continue cooperating with law enforcement. And one of the things that I think, so I was fairly involved with Occupy Wall Street. And I think one of the things that I really thought a lot about back then and has stuck with me is how much crime is committed in the US that is not treated like crime, whether we're talking about wage theft or whether we're talking about corporate malfeasance at a huge level. And the dollars just don't add up when you're talking about theft. To make, you know, I'm sorry, there's a bit of background noise and I apologize for that.
We hear you fine.
Okay, cool. So basically, Zoom is saying all of these companies that can pay for our service, they get privacy and security. All of the people who are not able to pay for our service, we're going to continue to make their conversations accessible to law enforcement. There is pretty much no reason to believe that there is any higher level of criminality or malfeasance happening on these free Zoom calls than on the subscription Zoom calls. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is both important for looking at how tech companies are not supporting activists, and also how tech companies are continuing to feed into narratives that are inherently dangerous for marginalized communities, because we have known for so long that whether or not what you are doing is bad, what you look like and what your beliefs are affect how you are viewed by law enforcement and how much suspicion they have of your behaviors or even just your existence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, that's on huge display today out in the street, where, you know, Black folks are you know, just saying over and over, the color of our skin has been a badge that we have worn for 400 years in this country, that has worked to marginalize us and put us in categories that are just automatically suspicious and automatically targeted. And you know, it's time for that to stop. It's time for folks to become aware of that. I think that, to me, that's the perhaps the biggest transformation that I'm seeing and that I'm hoping will continue is consciousness raising, especially among white folks who, you know, have largely been able to turn the other way and not notice and not really pay attention because it wasn't in their interest to pay attention, or it just hurt so much it was easier not to notice. So you can't not notice anymore.
So to try and help address that, I used my professional as a librarian in putting together a race policing and protest guide. And I'm really happy with the section I have on like what is white privilege, as well as I was able to pull from there's a few interesting sources. You mentioned in your email that there's folks who are putting together lists in Google Docs and sharing those. So I actually pulled some of the stuff from those lists that are about to help white people educate ourselves about stuff. There's podcasts and films that were all shared on this resource called the Anti-Racism Resources, which has a very easy, tiny URL. It's bit.ly/anti-racism resources. But the anti-racism resources part is in all caps, that has books and articles and podcasts and movies. And it starts with resources for white parents to raise anti-racist children. And it's just a really good opener, because there's also stuff like a PBS article on teaching your children about Black History Month. And it's kind of a nice intro into what is, you are quite right to describe it as something that it is hard to look at. Like looking at the history of racism in America, being a white American, it hurts to do it. It's easier to look at other things. And with the way like media representation is more broadly in our culture, it's really easy to ignore race. One of the odder conversations I had with a friend of mine, this was a little while ago, but still in St. Louis, he was talking about, you know, he doesn't see color. And I was like, that's actually a real problem. You should, like, because there was this like moral agenda that was pushed as this is how you're kind, is you act like you can't tell if someone is Black. It's also very interesting in the library I work in, if somebody comes to the desk and asks a question and leaves, and somebody else comes up and they go, oh, was someone just here? And you say, yes. And they said, what did they look like? I have watched white librarians not be able to say if a patron was Black. Like they can't, they were like, they were young and tall. It's interesting because there's this notion that it's some rude. The weirdest one I was part of that conversation was I was talking about the comedy show In Living Color. Like, oh, is that why the word color is in the title? And I was just like, I'm going.
Wow. Lena, I think you just froze there for a minute, Lena. Great shot of you, though.
We're gonna have to come back and get a screen capture of it from the
yeah, for sure.
Profile photo.
For sure, that's a good one, Lena. So Rosa Gina, while Lena is recovering from her In Living Color reaction, tell us more. I was reading about this application called CARD. Are you familiar with that application?
So I looked very, very briefly, and it seems like CARD is a way of throwing up fast, easy websites, basically. And I saw the one you linked to, and I really liked that one because it included links to BLM Canada and BLM Australia and some other similar topics that are a little bit more international. And I think it's really neat to start being able to see how we can build something that's going to be across borders, because this is not only an issue in the US. So that's cool. And I that's also been something I've been really excited to see emerging through the increased visibility of the topics on social media.
I think Lena's coming back. Hey, Lena, you're back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. You froze with your hysterical reaction to Living Color. It was a great shot.
Okay, well, that's fine.
While you were coming back to us, Rosa Gina and I were just talking about the application cards, and there's one particular site I just wanted to call it out. It's called blacklivesmatters.carrd.co, blacklivesmatters.carrd.co, and it has a wealth of information about the protest movements, about ways to stay safe, about ways to protect yourself from the police. And you're talking about the global aspects of the whole protest movement, Rosa Gina. And I thought that map was amazing. When you click on the map and you see the protests all across the planet on virtually every continent. I guess not counting Antarctica, but every populated continent, there's stuff going on.
I mean, I feel like we should probably double check on Antarctica because they've come through for us in that.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Okay.
I would double check because sometimes
I just kind of said that, but I do need to double check. I misspoke without having the facts.
I mean, I'm not certain, but I can hold out hope that the scientists down there recognize that this is something for them to participate in as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the one other piece of tech that I want to mention is there's a website that sells games, independently developed games. It's called itch.io, and they have a bundle for racial justice and equality, and they are trying to sell $1 million of games, or $5 million of games for with a contribution to cool stuff, but they're selling so many games. So I bought so many video games, and I can use the excuse of protest and wanting the world to be a better place for it. But it's interesting to see how various corners of tech are responding. So there's like in library land, there's a group called Spark, which pushes for open access, free scientific research. Their statement on Black Lives Matter and racial justice was so solid and such a good, like, long read that I was like, wow, folks who are really into open access also want the world to be a better place in a lot of other ways. Mm-hmm. But it's odd to balance that with the occasional company who's just like, we care too, and I'm like, I don't know if you do. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know how much Amazon is really means it when they say they care.
If you ask me, they need to write a huge check for reparations to a whole bunch of folks, given the resources that they have. Statements from them are, in my mind, hollow. You know, it's all about the equity. You know, I did want to read it, as you guys know, and Dave, I'm not sure if he's still tuned in. Both Dave and I are members of the Internet Society. And Dave, I don't know if you had a chance to see, but the Internet Society New York chapter released an open letter to Black America. And I just wanted to read it, just for the record, dated June 6, 2020. The Internet Society New York chapter stands in solidarity with the protesters that are marching and demanding equity and justice for Black Americans across New York City and the nation. ISOC New York has long recognized the systemic racism in America. Here in New York, we are working to do our part by partnering with community-based organizations that are taking control and providing free internet access and technology resources to their underserved public and affordable housing residents. The Internet Society knows that community networks can empower neglected, under-resourced communities with technology and services that they themselves can use to bridge not only the digital divide, but the economic, educational, and racial divides that have separated this nation at its core and are now crying out for redress. We believe that special initiatives such as those undertaken, supported, and proposed by ISOC New York are urgently needed. We call upon corporations, foundations, and governments across the nation to respond and fund innovative community-based solutions that address the crippling impacts of racism in our nation. ISOC New York is working with the Internet Society Foundation and our community partners to help move such efforts from rhetoric to action. We must not rest until the internet is for everyone. It's not only a goal, but a reality. Black America, ISOC New York hears you. We support you. We stand with you. Signed, Greg Shatton, President of ISOC New York. So I was very proud that Greg put that together on behalf of the society. And in particular, we're talking about, hollow statements versus what can you do? And I was very gratified that in his statement, he called upon corporations, foundations, and governments to respond and fund community-based solutions. I think that's very much what we need. Lena knows we've been working in this whole community network space for more than a decade. And we've recently partnered with the Internet Society. They've been a great partner in helping to move things along. And between the pandemic and what's going on now with the racial protest, it's just so clear that the internet divide needs to be bridged and it needs to be addressed right away. So I was very happy to be part of this statement from Hindsight, New York. Dave, had you seen that statement, Dave?
Absolutely, and I was glad to see you wrote it,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm all in support of it. The cost of connecting people is going down rapidly because of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
In China, data service on your phone has gone down in price 30% since the beginning of the year. It's down to about $12 as for the standard package. It had been $18. And when we talk about what's happening in advanced wireless, which a lot of people think has to do with 5G, which it doesn't, but that's not this conversation. The takeaway for people working out there is the technology is getting better so you can do things you couldn't do before. Let me throw that back to you, Stu.
Okay, well, thank you, Dave. Do we have some wrap up comments? We got about 5 minutes or so left in the show. Maybe Rosa Gina can tell us what she sees in her crystal ball in terms of how technology is moving and can further help to kind of advance things forward and help the whole progressive movement. Do you see anything, any trends that might be encouraging?
Well, I am hopeful that other people's optimism about how technology can support cooperative businesses and other community development initiatives can how that can work. I think that we have to remember that this isn't just about policing. This is about a lot more. So I'm cautiously optimistic that beyond the ways that emerging tech can facilitate some of these ideas that we've had longer term on how you build community power, that some of it can also help to address bias more broadly, and especially anti-Black bias. Ahmaud Arbery was not killed by the police.
Right.
And COVID is also not the police, though I'm a fan of neither. And I'm really hopeful that we can get some progress in other aspects of society as well from new tech.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen friends who I didn't expect to pop up their numbers on Signal. That gives me hope that there are people who are going, I might have conversations that I want to have privacy for. And even if that happens to be because of protest or politics or what, it is something that goes in kind of, for me, it's something where I'm like, which of the people I know are maybe shifting some ideology into seeing that there's something wrong, like they want to be able to have conversation with, and they have an inkling that people might listen to them if they have these conversations without them wanting to, which is a weird kind of metric to apply. But I've seen some names pop up on Signal where I was like, oh, I wouldn't have expected you on Signal, but now that you're here, welcome. Here's a pretty gif of like a unicorn. I hope you stay. Because I saw a similar uptick when Trump became president.
So I actually have one other thing that I want to throw out there that gives me a little bit of hope. Facebook has this thing where it'll remind you about stuff you posted in the past. A lot of other platforms have also incorporated this. And I am hoping that that kind of automated tech reminder, while it's not always great in certain ways, I'm hoping that it means that people's posts that they are making right now will come back to them in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, because the way we're going to get the change that we all need is through a continued push. It's not next week, it's the long term. And I'm hoping that when people hear their words in the future, they'll believe themselves. And from that, they will believe Black voices when they're talking about the problems that they're still facing.
That's a good point, Rosa Gina. I hadn't even thought about that feature, but that's excellent. Okay, David, any final words before we say goodbye here, Dave?
And learn from people who never gave up fighting. And hopefully there's another generation who will continue that fight.
Absolutely. I'm really encouraged by looking at these young kids out there. I have a son. I think of him as a kid, but he looks at me and said, "Dad, I'm not a kid. I'm going to be 40 this year." And he looks at the young people out there and he says, he's been telling me how encouraged he is at the young people, the energy, the enthusiasm, and just a total lack of fear. And that's something that we really need today. We really need that. So I'm really happy. I'm really encouraged. I'm really excited to see all the folks out there. I was looking at folks in South Africa on a knee doing the Colin Kaepernick. I mean, it was like I almost came to tears looking at that. It's incredible, just the global connectivity that this tragedy has brought on. And I think on top of the pandemic, it has really, I think, brought the world together in some ways that we just could not have imagined. So I'm excited about that. I'm hopeful about that. And again, I'm hopeful that I know it's going to take a while. Rosa Gina, you're absolutely right. It's not going to happen in 6 months or a year, but I'm hoping the seeds are planted for a real transformation of thinking and consciousness across the planet. That's my hope. Okay. Well, thank you all. You've been listening to Community and Technology with special guest today, Rosa Gina Lawrence, and our ever faithful Alina Marvin and Dave Burstein. Thank you guys for listening. Community and Technology. See you guys next week, Wednesday, 5 p.m. Take care. I found out on my way to Harlem